Hey, thanks for stopping by. This is an original story from Hidden Revenge Family, and it took a turn you truly didn't see coming. Let's get into it.
Rain hit my windshield so hard I could barely see the street signs, and that felt appropriate. I was on my way to a law office in downtown Washington, D.C., where my sister's life was about to be summarized in paperwork and divided like office supplies. The building had marble floors and a lobby that smelled like leather and expensive silence. I checked in at the front desk, gave my name, and ignored the way the receptionist looked at my scuffed boots. I had been out of the army for 3 months. My hands were still rough, my posture still straight. Civilian life hadn't softened me yet. When I walked into the conference room, Beatrice was already there. She looked like she had stepped out of a campaign ad. Perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect smile that didn't reach her eyes. The silver eagle on her dress uniform caught the light just right. Public Affairs Colonel Beatrice Whitmore, my younger sister, the family headline. Across from her sat our parents Jerry and Martha. They were angled toward her, not me. Their chairs practically touched hers. My chair sat alone on the other side of the table like it had been assigned after a small argument. Clara, Beatrice said, giving me a polite nod like we were co-workers who barely tolerated each other. Colonel, I replied. Her smile tightened. She hated when I used her rank outside official settings. I did it anyway. The attorney, Mr. Feldman, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He had the calm voice of a man who had delivered bad news for a living. On the table in front of him sat a thick folder labeled with Abigail's name, Abigail Whitmore, our oldest sister, the quiet one, the one who never bragged, the one who died 2 months ago after a long illness she barely talked about. I sat down and folded my hands on the table. They were scarred and calloused from years of moving equipment, loading crates, running logistics operations most people never saw. I noticed Beatrice glance at them, and then at my plain jacket like she was comparing resumes. Mr. Feldman began reading. Abigail's voice echoed in my head as he spoke, because I knew she had written this carefully. She was like that, precise, intentional, never dramatic. To Beatrice Whitmore, she left the family residence in Arlington. The house was valued at just over $1.4 million. She also left multiple investment accounts totaling approximately $600,000. There were gasps, small, polite ones from my parents. My mother reached for Beatrice's hand immediately. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, as if Beatrice had just survived something difficult, instead of winning a financial lottery. Beatrice lowered her eyes in a performance of humility. "Abigail always believed in potential," she said softly. I looked at the attorney. "And me." He flipped a page. To Clara Whitmore, he read, "I leave a personal item of mine. It is stored in a sealed box to be delivered at the time of this reading." The door opened and an assistant carried in a medium-sized cardboard box that looked like it had been sitting in a garage for a decade. The edges were worn, one corner was taped twice. The assistant placed it in front of me. I didn't touch it yet. "That's it?" my father asked. Mr. Feldman nodded. "Those are the terms of the will." The room felt smaller, not because of the space, but because of the silence. Beatrice let out a short laugh before she could stop herself. "I'm sorry," she said, though she didn't sound sorry. That's very Abigail." I finally pulled the box toward me and opened it. Inside was a folded Army service uniform, old style, the kind issued over a decade ago. The fabric was dusty and the name tape read A. Whitmore. I stared at it. It wasn't dress blues, it wasn't decorated with medals, it was a standard operational uniform, the kind you wear when nobody is watching. My mother leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said carefully, "that seems symbolic." "Symbolic of what?" I asked. Beatrice crossed her legs. "Of realism." I looked up at her. "You were always practical, Clara," she continued. "Abigail knew that. You don't care about money or assets. You were content doing paperwork in supply rooms while the rest of us aimed higher." I kept my face neutral. In the Army, I had learned that silence can make people uncomfortable. I let it work. "I managed logistics for 3 joint operations," I said evenly, "including overseas deployments." "Yes," she replied, smiling. "Spreadsheets in a camouflage uniform." My father chuckled. "Beatrice worked with senior leadership," he added. "Strategic communications. Public presence. That's impact. Impact." I thought about the nights I slept on concrete floors to keep supply chains running, the hours spent rerouting medical shipments so units wouldn't run out of supplies, no cameras, No press briefings, just work that had to get done. My mother looked at me with what she probably thought was kindness. Clara, you never had Beatrice's ambition, she said. This is fair. Abigail must have seen that. The house and investments would have been wasted on you. You prefer simplicity. There it was, fair. I ran my thumb over the fabric of the uniform. It felt heavier than it looked. Beatrice leaned forward slightly. Honestly, Clara, that uniform suits you. Old, worn, practical. Very on brand. She smiled wider. It's fitting, she added. A reminder of where you peaked. The words hung in the air. I could have argued. I could have listed achievements, awards, evaluations. I could have pointed out that public affairs officers don't deploy the same way logistics officers do. Instead, I closed the box. If that's everything, I said to the attorney, I'll take my property. Beatrice laughed openly this time. Property, she repeated. It's a used uniform. My father nodded. You should be grateful she left you anything. I stood up slowly, not angry, not shaking, just steady. Abigail had never been careless. She didn't make emotional decisions. If she left me this uniform, she had a reason. I met Beatrice's eyes. You seem very confident, I said. I earned it, she replied. I lifted the box and tucked it under my arm. It wasn't heavy, but the room felt heavier as I walked toward the door. Right before I reached it, Beatrice spoke again. Clara, she called out. Try not to sell that online. I'd hate for family memorabilia to end up on eBay. My mother laughed softly. I turned halfway back. Don't worry, I said. I know the difference between something worthless and something underestimated. Beatrice rolled her eyes. As I stepped into the hallway, the door closed behind me with a soft click. I stood there for a moment holding the box that apparently represented my entire inheritance. Have you ever been the one who did the real work while someone else took the spotlight and then got told you should be grateful for the scraps? If that sounds familiar, tell me in the comments. I want to know how you handled it. I was still standing in the foyer of the Arlington house when Beatrice told me I had until morning to leave. The rain outside had turned into a steady storm, hitting the tall windows hard enough to sound personal. The house looked the same as it had for years. Polished floors. Framed family photos, furniture. Nobody was allowed to sit on unless guests were over. The only difference was that now Beatrice stood in the center of it, like she had just closed on a business deal. I've already called a contractor, she said, scrolling through her phone. We're converting this place into a consulting office. High-end, clean lines, less history. Our parents sat on the couch behind her. My mother had a blanket over her knees like this was just another quiet evening. You can't possibly need more than tonight, Beatrice added. You travel light. I had a duffel bag in my old bedroom upstairs, a few civilian clothes, my discharge paperwork. The box with Abigail's uniform sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left it after the will reading. It hasn't even been 24 hours, I said. Beatrice looked up from her phone. The property transferred immediately, I checked. Of course she did. My father cleared his throat. It's cleaner this way, Clara. No confusion about boundaries. Boundaries. That was new. For years, I had been expected to come home on leave, help fix things, move things, drive them to appointments. Boundaries had not been part of that arrangement. I'll be out tonight, I said. Beatrice smiled. Good, I knew you'd be reasonable. Reasonable. That was the family word for obedient. I walked upstairs to my old room. The walls were still painted the same pale blue from when I was 16. My trophies were gone. I had packed them away years ago because they didn't fit the image of the house. Beatrice's awards still lined the hallway downstairs in matching frames. I stuffed my clothes into the duffel bag. I moved efficiently the way I had in barracks before deployment. No wasted motion, no dramatic pauses. When I picked up the box with Abigail's uniform, I hesitated for half a second. Then I slid it into the bag, carefully making sure it didn't crease more than it already had. By the time I came back downstairs, Beatrice was on a video call with someone. Yes, she was saying, we'll need the downstairs cleared, all of it. I want a reception area here, something impressive. She glanced at me as I walked toward the door. Lock up when you leave, she said casually. Actually, no, just hand me the key. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. The brass was worn from years of use. I placed it on the entry table. My mother stood up finally. Clara, don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm not, I said. You always take things so personally, she added. I looked at her. I was told to leave my home in the middle of a storm. It's not your home anymore, Beatrice said without looking up from her screen. That settled it. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in immediately. The rain soaked through my jacket within seconds. I didn't look back. My car was parked along the curb. I tossed the duffel bag into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat. The windshield fogged up fast. For a moment, I just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, watching the house through blurred glass. The lights inside were bright, warm, controlled. I started the engine and drove. I didn't go far. A cheap motel off Route 50 had a vacancy sign flickering in the rain. The parking lot was half empty. The office smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Single room, the clerk asked without interest. Just for a few nights, I replied. He handed me a key card and pointed toward the far end of the building. The room was small but clean. One bed, one chair, a desk that had seen better years. The air conditioner rattled when I turned it on. I set the duffel bag on the floor and placed the box on the bed. For a moment, the silence pressed in. No family voices, no polished speeches, no comparisons, just the sound of rain against thin walls. I opened the box again and lifted out Abigail's uniform. It smelled faintly like storage dust and old fabric. I shook it out gently and held it up. The name tape looked slightly faded. The stitching was still solid. Paperwork, Beatrice had said. I almost laughed. In the Army, logistics isn't paperwork. It's movement. It's fuel, food, ammunition, medical supplies. It's making sure people don't run out of what keeps them alive. When operations succeed, nobody thanks logistics. When they fail, everyone notices. I remembered my first deployment briefing. Beatrice had been praised in a family group chat that same week for appearing on a news segment. My father had sent screenshots. My mother had added heart emojis. Nobody had asked where I was shipping out. I took a hanger from the closet and draped the uniform over it. In the mirror above the desk, I caught my reflection. Hair damp from rain, jaw tight, eyes tired but steady. They called me unambitious. But I had turned down a promotion once because it would have moved me into a desk job stateside. I had chosen field work instead, chosen responsibility over visibility. That wasn't lack of ambition, that was choosing impact over applause. I stepped closer to the uniform to smooth out a fold near the collar. That's when I felt it. A slight bump along the inside lining near the left side seam. I paused. I ran my fingers along it again. Definitely uneven, not part of the standard stitching. Abigail had been meticulous. She wouldn't have left something half done. I turned the uniform inside out carefully. The interior lining looked normal at first glance. Same fabric, same color, but along one seam, the thread was a slightly different shade, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I pressed against the fabric again. There was something thin and solid between the layers. Not bulky, not metallic enough to feel like a coin. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That was training. When something doesn't make sense, you don't panic. You assess. I set the uniform flat on the bed and studied the stitching. Abigail had left me this. Not money, not property. This, and she had never done anything by accident. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. I reached into my toiletry kit and pulled out a small pair of folding scissors. I held them over the seam but didn't cut yet. If something was hidden inside, it had been sewn there deliberately. That meant it mattered. I exhaled slowly, then I made the first careful cut. I slid the scissors under the altered seam and made a second careful cut. The thread came loose easily, like it had been stitched by someone who knew exactly how much tension to use. I widened the opening just enough to reach 2 fingers inside. Something flat pressed against my knuckles. I pulled it out slowly. It wasn't cash, it wasn't jewelry, it wasn't a handwritten letter full of final words. It was a challenge coin. Matte black. No unit name, no motto, just a subtle insignia etched into the center, an eagle with its wings angled downward instead of spread wide. The edges were worn smooth, but the face looked untouched. I flipped it over. Embedded into the back was a small circular insert. Not decorative, functional. A thin metallic disc with a barely visible port the size of a pinhead. I stared at it. Abigail didn't collect random souvenirs. And she definitely didn't modify them. I ran my thumb over the insert again. It wasn't glued on. It was machined into the coin. That meant it had been built this way. A microchip. I had worked around enough secure logistics systems to recognize the design. Not consumer grade. Not something you order online. This was integrated, intentional, and probably encrypted. I set the coin on the desk and sat back in the chair. The neon sign outside flickered through the thin curtains, casting inconsistent light across the room. Red, dark, red again. "Okay, Abigail," I muttered. "What were you really doing?" Officially, she had worked in administrative support for years. A quiet position, no headlines, no medals displayed in the hallway. That's what we were told. But this wasn't administrative support. I picked up the coin again and held it closer to the desk lamp. No serial number, no branch identifier, no public insignia. That alone was a statement. There are units in the military that don't advertise themselves. You don't find their logos on t-shirts. You don't post about them online. You don't even say their names casually. Beatrice would have known that. Which meant if she knew this coin existed, she would want it. A knock hit the motel wall next to my room. Loud, sudden. I froze for half a second, then stood and moved to the window without turning on any additional lights. I lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see the parking lot. A black SUV idled near the far corner, engine running, headlights off. I narrowed my eyes. The driver's door opened. Grant stepped out. He looked exactly like a defense contractor who enjoyed telling people he was a defense contractor. Clean cut, confident posture, expensive jacket that probably cost more than my monthly base pay used to be. He pretended to check his phone while scanning the row of motel doors. He wasn't staying here. He was looking for me. I let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window. So that didn't take long. Beatrice had wasted no time moving me out of the house. Now her husband was casually driving by a low-budget motel in the rain. That wasn't about real estate. I picked up the coin again and turned it in my hand. They weren't just securing property. They were searching for something specific. Something they hadn't found, which meant they didn't know Abigail had hidden it in the uniform. Good. Another knock echoed, this time on my actual door. 3 firm taps. Not hotel staff. Not hesitant. I didn't respond. Clara Grant's voice carried through the thin door. I stayed silent. "I know you're in there," he continued, casual but tight. "Your car's outside." I looked at the coin, then at the door. He knocked again. "Beatrice is worried about you," he said. "You left in a rush. Worried." That almost made me smile. I walked to the door quietly and stopped a few feet away. "What do you want?" I asked without opening it. A short pause. "Just checking in," he replied. "Family should stick together." "Then why are you outside a motel at 10:30 at night?" I asked. Another pause. Slightly longer. "I had business nearby." "Route 50 is not a business district." Silence. Then he shifted tone. "Look, Clara," he said. "If there's anything from Abigail that you're not sure about, any documents, any storage keys, we should go through them properly, for legal reasons." There it was, not grief, not concern, inventory. "I received exactly what was stated in the will," I said evenly. "And that was," he asked. "A uniform." He exhaled softly, not disappointed, calculating. "If you come across anything else," he added, "you should let Beatrice know. It would avoid unnecessary misunderstandings." Unnecessary misunderstandings. Like what? Accusations, investigations, frozen accounts. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. He stood there another few seconds. Then his footsteps retreated. I waited until I heard the SUV door shut and the engine rev before I looked outside again. The vehicle pulled out slowly, headlights still off until it reached the main road. He hadn't come to intimidate me. He had come to confirm whether I had something, which meant they were missing it. I locked the deadbolt and sat back down at the desk. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and set it beside the coin. I didn't have the tools to access whatever chip was embedded in it, not here, not in a motel room, but I didn't need to access it yet. I needed to understand why they were this nervous. Grant worked in private military contracting. He dealt with procurement, overseas logistics, subcontracting. He had access to large budgets and even larger opportunities. If Abigail had been involved in something sensitive, something tied to funding or operational networks, a physical token like this coin could be an authentication device, not symbolic, functional. I turned it over again and examined the insignia more closely. The eagle wasn't decorative, it was precise, minimalist, almost anonymous, no name, no motto, no branch. That kind of design isn't about pride, it's about discretion. I leaned back and let the pieces settle. Beatrice had been confident during the will reading, too confident. She didn't act like someone who had just been surprised by an inheritance. She acted like someone who had expected it, which meant she had likely seen an earlier draft, or influenced something, or accessed information she shouldn't have. But if she had known about this coin, she would have taken the uniform apart herself. She hadn't. That told me two things. One, Abigail trusted me with something she didn't trust anyone else with. Two, Beatrice and Grant were searching blind. I looked around the small motel room, the flickering neon light, the thin walls, the outdated furniture. They thought I was alone and outmatched. They thought I had been handed a symbolic consolation prize. But they were circling a motel in the rain because they knew something valuable was missing. And now it was sitting in my hand. This wasn't about a house. It wasn't about investments. It was about whatever Abigail had protected long enough to sew into a uniform. And if Grant was already watching parking lots, that meant the clock had started. I drove to the public library as soon as it opened and brought the coin with me in my jacket pocket. If Grant was watching motels, he wasn't expecting me to sit under fluorescent lights between a row of retirees and a college kid writing a term paper. The DC Public Library wasn't glamorous, but it had stable internet private study rooms and zero emotional history. I signed in for a small study room and locked the door behind me. The coin sat on the table in front of me. I had stopped by an electronics store on the way and bought a universal USB reader kit. It wasn't military grade, but the port on the coin looked adaptable. If the chip was encrypted, I'd at least see the structure. I connected the smallest adapter and plugged it into my laptop. For a second, nothing happened. Then a secure drive prompt appeared. No label, no visible directory, just a request for authentication. I stared at it. Abigail wouldn't have left something I couldn't open. She knew my background. She knew I understood secure access protocols. I examined the coin again and noticed something I had missed in the motel light. Along the rim were tiny engraved numbers. Not decorative, sequential. I typed them in as the access key. The drive opened instantly. Inside were 3 folders. OPS Trust, Logs. I exhaled slowly. I opened OPS first. What I saw erased every version of Abigail our family had ever described. She wasn't an administrative assistant. She wasn't a quiet paper pusher. She was listed as Logistics Director, Special Operations Support Network. The files were detailed but structured efficiently. Supply chain routes for classified deployments. Emergency contingency funding transfers. Equipment staging across multiple states and overseas locations. Names were redacted, but the pattern was clear. She hadn't been in the spotlight because her job wasn't to be seen. She had been coordinating behind the curtain. I scrolled through operation summaries, each one linked to successful missions that had made national headlines years ago, the kind Beatrice had proudly referenced during press briefings. Abigail had made those missions possible. Without her network, none of them would have moved. I leaned back in the chair. My entire life, my family had treated visibility as value. If it wasn't televised, it didn't count. If it didn't come with applause, it wasn't important. Abigail had built an invisible infrastructure, and she had done it quietly. I opened the second folder, Trust. A legal document appeared on screen, Private Military Security Trust, registered under a discrete holding entity. Total fund value $2,013,847.62. $2 million, not inheritance money, operational reserve funds. The document outlined access conditions. The trust was activated only through biometric confirmation paired with possession of an authentication token. The token's ID matched the serial signature embedded in the coin. The coin wasn't symbolic, it was the key. I kept reading. In the event of Abigail Whitmore's incapacitation or death, trusteeship would transfer to the designated successor, Clara Whitmore. I stopped. Not Beatrice, not our parents, me. Abigail had filed this years ago, long before she got sick. She hadn't left me scraps. She had left me authority. The final folder sat there quietly. Logs. I opened it. A spreadsheet appeared with transaction histories. Clean, organized, time-stamped. My eyes moved automatically, scanning patterns the way I used to scan supply manifests before deployment. You don't read every line. You look for irregularities. There. 6 months ago, a series of transfers, large amounts, $150,000, $80,000, $120,000, authorized under Abigail's credentials. But something was wrong, the timestamps. The first transfer occurred on a date I knew well, It was the week Abigail had been admitted to the hospital's intensive care unit. I had visited her that Tuesday. She had been weak, barely able to speak clearly. She wasn't logging into secure trust accounts. I cross-referenced the login IP addresses attached to the entries. All domestic, all routed through a private network registered to a contracting firm. I recognized the company name instantly. Grant Defense Solutions, LLC. My jaw tightened. I kept scrolling. Over the next 3 months, more transfers. Not enough to drain the fund entirely, but enough to siphon substantial amounts. Always under Abigail's credentials. Always routed through the same corporate entity. I checked the signature verification logs attached to each transaction. Digital authorization, with an encrypted override. The override key matched a secondary admin profile. Beatrice Whitmore. I stared at the screen. Beatrice didn't just inherit a house. She and Grant had been draining money from a private operational trust, while Abigail was hospitalized, while she was dying. I pulled up the hospital admission records I still had saved in my email. Dates aligned perfectly. Every major withdrawal corresponded to a period when Abigail had been sedated or under heavy medication. They hadn't just taken advantage of paperwork. They had exploited a sick woman. I closed my eyes for a moment and forced myself to breathe evenly. Anger is loud. Strategy is quiet. I opened a new document and began copying the relevant transaction logs into an encrypted external drive. Dates, amounts, IP traces, admin overrides. I labeled everything carefully. In logistics, documentation is power. If you can prove the chain of movement, you control the narrative. When I finished, I disconnected the coin and removed the adapter. The study room felt smaller now, but not because I was overwhelmed. Because I understood the scale. Abigail hadn't been small. She had been operating at a level my family would never have respected, because it didn't come with a microphone. Beatrice and Grant hadn't just wanted the house. They had been looking for this. The coin was the only physical proof of trusteeship. Without it, the trust would remain partially accessible through admin credentials. With it, I had full authority, and I had evidence of fraud. I slid the coin back into my pocket and shut down the laptop. Grant hadn't been checking on me out of concern. He had been checking to see whether I had found what they were missing. Now I knew exactly what they had done, and exactly how far they were willing to go to keep it quiet. I walked into the promotion dinner knowing Beatrice had already figured out I was asking questions. The event was held at a private dining room in a high-end restaurant in D.C., the kind of place where the waiters glide instead of walk. Gold lighting, white tablecloths, crystal glasses lined up like a military formation. Beatrice stood near the center of the room in a fitted navy dress, shaking hands with officers and contractors like she was running for office. Grant hovered close behind her, smiling at the right moments, nodding at the right jokes. My parents were glowing. Colonel Whitmore, someone said loudly as I approached. Model officer, Beatrice laughed modestly. It takes a team. I noticed a few heads turn when they saw me. The looks were subtle, quick, assessing. News travels fast in military circles, faster when it's engineered. Beatrice spotted me and excused herself from a small group. She walked over with a controlled smile. You came, she said. You invited me, I replied. That was before you started digging through Abigail's accounts. There it was, no denial, no confusion. I had access, I said calmly. As the designated trustee, her eyes sharpened. Careful, she said quietly. That kind of language can sound delusional. I almost smiled. The documents say otherwise. Grant stepped in smoothly. Clara, we're concerned about you. Concerned. That word again. Concerned enough to reroute funds while Abigail was in the ICU, I asked. His expression didn't change, but the temperature between us did. You're misunderstanding standard asset consolidation, he replied. From her personal trust, I asked. Using her credentials. Beatrice's smile returned but thinner. This is exactly what I mean, she said softly. You're spiraling. Within minutes, I understood the room dynamic. Conversations would pause when I approached. One retired major gave me a sympathetic look and asked if I was doing okay since the discharge. Another officer mentioned hearing that I had been struggling. That was new. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway near the restrooms. I pulled out my phone and checked my email. 3 missed calls from a former logistics colleague. One message read, Hey, heard some rumors. Call me. I called him immediately. Clara? He answered, lowering his voice. Is everything all right? Define. All right, I said. There's talk that you removed items from Abigail's estate that weren't assigned to you, he said carefully. And that you've been unstable. I leaned against the wall. Unstable how PTSD related. Obsessive behavior. Accusations against family members. I exhaled slowly. Who started that, I asked. He hesitated. It's coming from public affairs channels. Unofficially, but you know how that works. Yes, I did. Beatrice didn't need to file a formal complaint. She just needed to plant the right concern in the right ears. Thanks, I said. I appreciate the heads up. When I walked back into the dining room, I felt it clearly now. The isolation, not loud, not dramatic, just subtle repositioning, people shifting away slightly, conversations tightening. Beatrice had weaponized perception. She raised her glass for a toast. To integrity, she said smoothly, to service, and to protecting the reputation of the uniform we wear. There were nods around the table. My mother looked directly at me when Beatrice said reputation. After the applause, my father approached me near the bar. What are you doing? He asked quietly. Reviewing financial records, I said. Stop, he said immediately. You're embarrassing your sister. She siphoned money from a secured trust, I replied. You don't know that, he snapped. I have transaction logs. He shook his head. You've always had a chip on your shoulder about Beatrice's success. That almost made me laugh. This isn't about success, I said. It's about fraud. He leaned closer. Listen to yourself. Accusing your own sister of criminal behavior. Over what, a uniform? Over what? I stared at him. Abigail left me trusteeship, I said. No, he replied flatly. She left you a box. My mother joined us, her expression tight. We've received calls, she said. People are worried about you. People I asked. Officers, friends. They say you've been making serious allegations without proof. I have proof, I said evenly. Then show it to the proper authorities, she replied. Not at dinner parties. I plan to. That landed. My mother's voice dropped. Clara, stop this. Apologize to your sister and let it go. Let what go, I asked. The theft. My father's face hardened. Enough. Beatrice appeared beside us as if on cue. Is there a problem? She asked lightly. No, my mother said quickly. We're just reminding Clara that family matters should stay private. Beatrice looked at me with controlled patience. You need help, she said quietly. And I don't mean that as an insult. I held her gaze. You've already started the narrative, I said. Why not finish it? She tilted her head slightly. Clara has been under a lot of stress since leaving active duty, she said louder, just enough for nearby guests to hear. Transitions are hard. There it was, reframed, compassion instead of accusation. It was almost impressive. I left the dinner early, no dramatic exit, no raised voices, just a quiet walk to my car. Halfway back to the motel, my phone buzzed. An official email notification. Department of Veterans Affairs. Subject line, temporary suspension notice. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and opened it, due to a formal complaint submitted regarding potential misconduct related to estate handling and concerns of mental instability, impacting financial decision-making. Your military retirement disbursement has been temporarily suspended pending review. I read it twice. Formal complaint, submitted by Colonel Beatrice Whitmore. Attached statements expressing concern about my erratic behavior and unauthorized access to sensitive financial materials. She had escalated, not gossip. Documentation. She had used her rank to give credibility to the accusation. My retirement pay wasn't massive, but it covered rent, utilities, groceries. It was stability, and she had just cut it off. I sat there in the car with the engine running, the email glowing on my screen. This wasn't about winning an argument anymore. They were trying to discredit me before I could act. Control the narrative, isolate the source, apply pressure, classic containment strategy. I closed the email and stared through the windshield at the pumps outside. They thought I would panic. They thought cutting off my income would force me to back down. Instead, something inside me shifted. I wasn't fighting for a house. I wasn't fighting for pride. I was now officially fighting a coordinated smear campaign backed by rank, reputation, and my own parents' endorsement. And they had just made it formal. I buttoned Abigail's uniform all the way to the collar and pinned the coin exactly where it belonged. The fabric felt different now that it was clean and pressed. Still old, still standard issue. No flashy medals, no decorative cords, just a name tape and years of quiet service stitched into it. I looked at myself in the motel mirror. If Beatrice was going to frame me as unstable, I wasn't going to show up defensive. I was going to show up precise. The gala was held at a five-star hotel in downtown DC, valet parking, red carpet at the entrance, a banner that read, "Honoring Excellence in Military Leadership." I walked past a line of decorated officers and contractors in tuxedos and evening gowns. Heads turned immediately, not because I looked out of place, because I looked deliberate. Abigail's uniform wasn't flashy, but it carried authority in a different way. It didn't ask for approval. Inside the ballroom was packed. Round tables covered in white linen, a stage at the front with a podium and a giant projection screen cycling through images of smiling officers in combat zones and press briefings. Beatrice stood near the stage in a deep emerald gown, holding a champagne flute. Her hair was styled perfectly. She was surrounded by senior officials and donors. She saw me within seconds. Her smile froze. Grant leaned in and followed her line of sight. His jaw tightened. I walked calmly toward the registration desk. "I'm here as a guest," I said, giving my name. The volunteer checked the list and hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing me a badge. As I turned, I heard Beatrice's heels approach across the polished floor. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly. "Attending," I replied. She glanced at the uniform with open disdain. "You can't be serious." "I am." She lowered her voice further. "You're making a scene." I haven't said a word. She stepped closer. "You were reported as unstable. Showing up like this isn't helping." I adjusted the coin on my chest slightly. "This is a regulation uniform." "It's not yours," she snapped. "Abigail left it to me." Grant joined us, smiling tightly at anyone watching. "Clara," he said smoothly, "this isn't the right setting for what I asked." Public recognition. Beatrice's eyes flicked to the coin. For the first time that night, I saw something close to uncertainty. "Take that off," she said. "Why?" "Because you don't understand what you're wearing." That confirmed it. I held her gaze. "I understand more than you think." Her composure cracked slightly. She turned and signaled discreetly to one of the event coordinators. Within seconds, a hotel security manager approached. "Is there a problem?" he asked politely. Beatrice's tone shifted instantly to concern. "This is my sister. She's been struggling recently. I'm worried she might disrupt the ceremony." The manager looked at me. "I have a valid guest badge," I said calmly. "I intend to sit and watch." "She's not in uniform clearance for tonight," Beatrice added. I almost laughed. "There's no such thing as uniform clearance at a civilian gala." Grant leaned in. "It would be better if you left voluntarily." I didn't move. Before the situation could escalate further, the lights dimmed slightly and the announcer's voice echoed through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We are about to begin." Beatrice gave me one last warning look and walked back toward the stage. I found a seat near the back of the ballroom where I had a clear view of everything. The program began with speeches about sacrifice, service, and integrity, words that sounded impressive under chandeliers. When it was time for the main award, the announcer's voice grew louder. "This year's Model Officer Award goes to Colonel Beatrice Whitmore." Applause filled the room. Beatrice rose gracefully and walked to the stage. She hugged the presenter, accepted the plaque, and stepped up to the podium. "Service is about responsibility," she began. "It's about protecting the reputation of the uniform and the institution it represents." I watched her carefully. "Leadership requires difficult decisions," she continued, "sometimes even within your own family." That line wasn't accidental. A few heads turned subtly toward me. She was cementing the narrative publicly. I stood up, not abruptly, not angrily, just stood. The room quieted, slightly confused. Beatrice paused mid-sentence when she saw me walking down the aisle toward the stage. Security shifted near the walls. I stopped a few feet from the platform. "I have something to add," I said clearly. Beatrice forced a laugh. "Clara, this isn't appropriate." "I agree," I replied. "Fraud usually isn't." Murmurs rippled across the room. Grant moved toward the front, but before he could reach me, another presence shifted the energy entirely. A tall figure seated near the front row stood up. 4 stars on his shoulders. The room fell silent. General Miller did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes fixed not on Beatrice, not on Grant, on the coin. He stopped directly in front of me. His face lost color. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. The entire ballroom held its breath. "It belonged to my sister," I said evenly. "Abigail Whitmore." He stared at the insignia for several seconds. Then, in full view of 300 guests, he brought his hand up in a crisp formal salute. "To me." Gasps filled the room. Beatrice's award plaque slipped slightly in her grip. General Miller lowered his hand slowly, still studying the coin. That insignia, he said carefully, is not ceremonial. The silence deepened. He looked at Beatrice. Colonel, he said, his tone no longer polite. Why is your sister wearing an authentication token from a restricted logistics command? Beatrice's lips parted, but no sound came out. Grant stopped moving. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The coin on my chest had just done what no argument ever could. And for the first time all night, Beatrice wasn't controlling the room. I held my posture while the entire ballroom watched General Miller look at the coin like it wasn't supposed to exist in public. He didn't repeat his question. Instead, he stepped up onto the stage and turned to face me fully. 300 guests shifted in their seats. The sound of cutlery and quiet whispers stopped completely. State your name, he said. Clara Whitmore, former Captain Logistics Corps. His eyes sharpened slightly. Relation to Abigail Whitmore. She was my sister. A pause. Then in front of everyone he straightened and gave me a formal salute. Not casual, not symbolic, regulation. The room reacted in a wave. Confusion, shock. Some officers stood instinctively out of respect. Beatrice remained frozen beside the podium, her award plaque clutched in both hands. I returned the salute, clean, controlled. General Miller turned toward the audience. For clarity, he said, his voice steady, but carrying across the ballroom the insignia. On that coin belongs to a restricted logistical command embedded within special operations infrastructure. He let that settle. It is not decorative. It is not honorary. It is not publicly acknowledged. A ripple moved through the room. He looked at Beatrice. Colonel, you would not have clearance to access information related to that unit. Beatrice swallowed. Sir, I was not aware. That is correct, he interrupted calmly. You would not be. Grant shifted a step backward. General Miller faced me again. Where did you obtain the coin? It was sewn into my sister's uniform, I said. She left it to me. His jaw tightened just slightly. Abigail Whitmore served as logistics director for that command, he said. Her role involved operational funding channels and contingency trust management. Several heads snapped toward Beatrice. General Miller continued. The associated trust funds are designed to ensure operational continuity in high-risk environments. Control of those funds transfers only through verified succession and possession of the authentication token. He nodded toward the coin on my chest. In plain terms, he added, whoever holds that coin and is designated in the trust structure holds authority. Beatrice finally found her voice. Sir, with respect, this is a private family matter. General Miller turned to her slowly. No, Colonel, he said evenly. It is not. The silence was absolute now. He looked back at me. Have you accessed the trust documentation? Yes, sir, and what did you find? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I found a series of unauthorized transfers executed under Abigail Whitmore's credentials while she was hospitalized in intensive care. Gasps broke out openly this time. Beatrice stepped forward quickly. That is an outrageous accusation. I reached into the inner pocket of the uniform and pulled out a slim, encrypted drive. I brought copies, I said. Grant moved instantly. This is inappropriate, stop. General Miller said without raising his voice. Grant stopped. I handed the drive to one of the aides standing near the stage. Transaction logs, IP trace reports, administrative override records. Dates correspond to hospital sedation periods. General Miller nodded to the aide who stepped aside to access a secure tablet. Beatrice looked at me like she couldn't decide whether to attack or deny. You're misinterpreting operational reallocations, she said. Abigail authorized asset consolidation before her condition worsened. She was under heavy sedation when the first transfer was initiated, I replied. I was in the room that week. My parents were standing now. Clara, stop this, my mother said from the front table. You're humiliating your sister. I looked at her. She humiliated herself, I said calmly. General Miller's aide approached and whispered something in his ear while showing him the tablet screen. I watched the general's expression shift from controlled to cold. He took the tablet and reviewed the data himself. Colonel Whitmore, he said. After a moment, why do these transfers route through a private contracting entity connected to your husband? Grant's face drained of color. Beatrice opened her mouth, then closed it again. These funds were redirected for strategic efficiency, she said finally. There was no malicious intent. Using encrypted override access tied to your credentials, General Miller asked. Silence. And during a period when Director Whitmore was medically incapacitated, he continued. Beatrice looked toward our parents like they could shield her. My father stepped forward. Sir, this is a misunderstanding. Our daughters are grieving. This is not about grief, General Miller said sharply. He looked back at me. Captain Whitmore, former captain, I corrected quietly. He nodded once. Former Captain Whitmore, according to these records, you are listed as the designated successor trustee of the Operational Security Fund. Yes, sir. That designation predates Colonel Whitmore's promotion, he said, glancing at Beatrice. Beatrice's composure cracked. This is absurd, she snapped. I have served with distinction. My record speaks for itself. Your record is precisely why this concerns me, General Miller replied. The room felt smaller now, but not because of pressure, because the illusion had collapsed. I stepped slightly forward, keeping my tone steady. There's more, I said. I pulled out printed copies of a separate document. Abigail's estate transfer paperwork for the Arlington property, I explained. The signature verification date is listed as 2 days after she was placed under assisted ventilation. Beatrice's head turned sharply toward me. The hospital log confirmed she was not physically capable of signing documents at that time. I continued. Digital signature authentication shows an override from a device registered under Grant Defense Solutions. Grant whispered something under his breath. My mother looked like she might faint. General Miller took the papers from my hand. He reviewed them carefully. Colonel, he said, his voice flat. Now, did you authorize estate transfer documents under your sister's credentials while she was incapacitated? Beatrice's silence answered before she did. I acted in the best interest of the family, she said finally. I let out a quiet breath. There it is, I said. Not anger, not triumph, just clarity. The general handed the documents back to his aide. Security, he said, calmly to the hotel staff at the perimeter. Contact military police liaison immediately. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Grant stepped back fully now. Beatrice looked at me with something I hadn't seen before. Not superiority, not pity, fear. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood there in Abigail's uniform, wearing the coin that proved what she had trusted me with. This wasn't about taking something from Beatrice. It was about restoring something she never understood. Authority doesn't come from applause. It comes from responsibility. I didn't move while military police officers walked into the ballroom. They didn't rush. They didn't create a scene. They approached General Miller, first received a short briefing, then turned toward Beatrice and Grant. Colonel Whitmore, one of the MPs, said calmly, "You'll need to come with us for questioning." The word questioning was polite. The tone was not optional. Beatrice looked around the room as if someone might intervene. No one did. Grant attempted one last controlled smile. "This is unnecessary. We can resolve this privately. You can explain that in the interview room," the MP replied. They were escorted out through a side exit, not handcuffed, not yet, but clearly no longer in control. 300 guests watched in silence as the model officer left her own award ceremony under investigation. My parents stood frozen near the front table. When the doors closed behind Beatrice and Grant, the room slowly exhaled. Conversation started again, but quieter, controlled. People checking phones, messaging, verifying. General Miller turned to me. "Remain available," he said. "You will likely be contacted for formal statements." "I understand, sir." He gave one short nod and walked away to speak with other senior officials. I stepped off the stage. My mother reached me first. "Clara," she said, grabbing my arm. "You've gone too far." I looked down at her hand until she released it. "She forged documents," I said. "She was protecting the family my father insisted. Abigail was dying. Things needed to be handled." By draining her trust and transferring property, I asked. "You're making it sound criminal," he snapped. "It is criminal." My mother's voice trembled. "We didn't know about the funds. We thought Beatrice was handling everything responsibly." "You didn't ask," I replied. They exchanged a glance. "We only ever wanted what was best for you," my mother said quickly. "We supported Beatrice because she was stable, predictable, and I wasn't," I asked. "You've always challenged things," my father said. "You question authority," I almost laughed. "That's called due diligence," I said. My mother lowered her voice. "You've made powerful enemies tonight." "No," I replied. "They made mistakes." I left the hotel without drama. The rain had stopped. The air felt clearer than it had in days. The next morning, I sat in a military police interview room. Neutral walls, metal table, recording device in plain view. I answered every question directly. Yes, I accessed the trust through the authentication token. Yes, I preserved digital logs. Yes, I confirmed hospital incapacitation dates. I provided copies of everything. They already had most of it from the drive I handed over at the gala. I just filled in context. Later that afternoon, I met with a civilian attorney I had contacted the night before. Former JAG, precise, unimpressed by rank. He reviewed the documentation quickly. "This is clean," he said. "You documented chain of custody properly. I learned from the best," I replied. He nodded slightly. "We'll file for immediate injunction on the Arlington property," he said. "Given the forged signature timeline, the transfer is legally voidable." "And the trust?" I asked. "You're the designated successor trustee," he said. "Once military police confirmed the fraud, we moved to freeze all associated accounts connected to the unauthorized transfers." I leaned back in the chair. Beatrice had built her reputation on perception, on carefully crafted narratives, on smiling at the right cameras. None of that mattered inside a legal filing. By evening, I received confirmation. Military police had opened a formal investigation into financial misconduct and abuse of authority. Grant's company accounts were under preliminary review. The next step came faster than even I expected. 2 days later, my attorney and I stood in a federal clerk's office finalizing the emergency petition. The judge signed the order. Temporary seizure of the Arlington property pending fraud adjudication. Immediate freeze on Beatrice Whitmore's personal accounts and any assets tied to the contested estate transfer. Asset preservation for restitution to the operational trust. The language was clinical, direct. Justice doesn't shout. It files paperwork. When the official notice was delivered, I was present at the house. Beatrice wasn't. Grant wasn't. My parents were. They looked smaller standing in the foyer than they ever had before. "What does this mean?" my mother asked as the process server handed over the documents. "It means the property reverts to the estate until the court resolves the fraud," I said. My father read the first page twice. "They're freezing Beatrice's accounts," he whispered. "Yes, she'll lose everything," my mother said. "She redirected funds that weren't hers," I replied evenly. "This is restitution." My father looked at me with something between anger and disbelief. "You would do this to your own sister." I held his gaze. "She did it to herself." Silence filled the entryway, the same entryway where they told me to leave in the rain. My mother stepped closer. "We were wrong," she said quickly. "We shouldn't have believed the rumors. We shouldn't have cut off your calls." "You blocked my number," I said. Her eyes filled with tears. "We thought you were unstable," she whispered. "Beatrice said you were spiraling. I was investigating." My father lowered himself into a chair. "All these years," he said quietly, "we thought Beatrice was the strong one." I didn't respond. Strength isn't volume, it's endurance. The movers hired by the court arrived shortly after to inventory high-value items for asset review. Art, jewelry, documents. I walked through the house once more. Same floors, same walls, different ownership. This time, no one asked me to leave. When I stepped back onto the porch, my attorney handed me a copy of the injunction order. "It's official," he said. "She no longer controls the property. And once the forensic audit finalizes, restitution payments to the trust will begin." I folded the document carefully. Inside the house, my parents sat quietly absorbing a reality they never expected. Beatrice had been the star. Stars look impressive from a distance. Up close, they burn out fast when their fuel runs out. And hers had just been cut off. I stood on the front porch of the Arlington house with Abigail's photo in my hand and the morning sun hitting the steps where I used to sit as a kid. The injunction had turned into a final ruling faster than most people expected. The forensic audit confirmed the unauthorized transfers. Digital overrides traced directly to Beatrice's credentials, routing paths tied to Grant's company. The estate transfer was voided. The trust was restored in full, including recovered funds. Beatrice accepted a plea agreement. Reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and resignation. She lost her commission. No more rank. No more ceremonies. No more podium speeches about integrity. Grant's contracting licenses were suspended pending further federal review. His company dissolved within months. Clients disappeared quickly once investigations became public record. Last I heard, Beatrice was working hourly shifts at a logistics warehouse in Northern Virginia. Not as a director, not as an executive, just moving inventory. There's something almost educational about that. Logistics isn't glamorous when there's no applause. The difference is some people understand its value. Others only understand status. I looked down at the photo in my hand. Abigail in uniform, no dramatic pose. Just a calm expression like she already knew how this would unfold. The $2 million in the trust account remained intact after restitution adjustments. Operational reserves were stabilized. Oversight was transferred formally under my trusteeship with General Miller's endorsement. But I didn't keep the funds sitting idle. I created a new structure under the trust's umbrella, the Whitmore Support Initiative, not a flashy foundation with gala dinners, a direct access assistance fund for service members transitioning out of active duty who were cut off by family, emergency housing grants, legal aid stipends, mental health coverage extensions, short-term income stabilization, practical support, no press conferences, no ribbon cuttings, just applications processed and resources delivered. I staffed it with 2 former logistics officers and 1 retired JAG attorney, people who understood documentation and discretion. Within 6 months, we had assisted 17 veterans. One of them had been living out of his car after his family refused to take him back. Another was a single mother discharged after medical separation facing eviction. None of them needed applause. They needed stability. Inside the house, most of the furniture had been removed during asset review. I kept what was functional and donated the rest. The place felt different now, not staged, not curated for image, clean, quiet. My parents no longer lived here. After the ruling, they downsized to a modest apartment 20 minutes away. I covered part of their rent, not generously, not resentfully, just enough to ensure basic comfort. They had asked once for a spare key to the house. No, I said, not angrily, just clearly. They visit occasionally. They sit at the kitchen table and speak more softly than they used to. My mother apologizes in small ways now. My father avoids eye contact when the subject of Beatrice comes up. I don't punish them, but I don't pretend either. Trust once broken doesn't regenerate because someone feels embarrassed. It rebuilds slowly, with boundaries. The porch boards creaked slightly under my boots as I stepped forward. I pinned Abigail's coin to the inside of the doorframe months ago, not visible from the street, not displayed like a trophy, just there, a reminder. General Miller called once after everything settled. You handled this professionally, he said. I handled it thoroughly, I replied. He gave a short laugh. Your sister underestimated you. She underestimated Abigail, I said. That was the truth. Beatrice believed influence came from visibility, from how many people applauded when you entered a room. Abigail understood something different. Power can exist quietly. Authority can operate without branding. And integrity doesn't need marketing. I walked back inside and set the photo on the hallway table, the same hallway where Beatrice's framed awards used to hang. Now there was only one frame. Abigail's uniform photo. No medals, no spotlight, just service. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood in the living room looking out through the front windows. The house was quiet, no comparison, no competition, just space. In the Army, we're taught something early that never makes it into speeches. The best-looking uniform isn't the one with the most rank on the shoulders. It's the one worn by someone who doesn't compromise their integrity when no one is watching. Abigail understood that. I understand it now in a way I didn't before. The night I was told to leave this house, I walked out in the rain carrying a dusty uniform in a cardboard box. They thought it was trash. They thought it was symbolic consolation for someone without ambition. It turned out to be access, responsibility, proof. Sometimes what looks small is only small to people who measure value by volume. Sometimes the thing dismissed as useless is the only thing that matters. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family because you weren't loud enough, flashy enough, or ambitious in the way they defined it, I want you to answer this honestly. Would you have had the courage to do what was right, even if it meant standing alone? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe. If you believe integrity still matters more than image. I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table one night, long after the house had gone quiet, staring at an old family photo I hadn't thrown away. Beatrice was in the center, of course, smiling wide, shoulders back. Even at 16, she knew how to pose like someone who expected applause. I was standing slightly behind her, half-turned like I wasn't sure if I belonged in the frame. That picture explained more than I used to admit. For years, I thought the conflict between us was about personality. She was outgoing, I was reserved. She liked recognition, I liked getting the job done. It seemed simple. It wasn't simple. It was structural. Every family builds a story about itself. And inside that story, everyone gets assigned a role. Beatrice was the star. I was the dependable one. Abigail was the quiet helper. The star gets defended. The dependable one gets used. The quiet helper gets ignored. That structure doesn't feel dangerous at first. It feels normal, predictable, comfortable, until something goes wrong. When I questioned the trust transfers, my parents didn't evaluate the evidence. They evaluated the roles. In their story, Beatrice was competent, stable, successful. In their story, I was practical, intense, sometimes too serious. So when she said I was spiraling, that version of me fit their narrative more easily than the version where she committed fraud. People rarely choose truth over comfort. They choose the story they already believe. And here's the part nobody talks about: you cannot out-argue a narrative that protects someone's identity. If my parents admitted Beatrice committed fraud, they would also have to admit they misjudged her for decades. They would have to admit they dismissed Abigail. They would have to admit they underestimated me. That's a heavy psychological bill. So instead, they tried to make me the problem. It's easier to label someone unstable than to admit you backed the wrong person. I learned something critical during that period. When someone has already decided who you are, explaining yourself becomes a performance, not a conversation. Every sentence you say gets filtered through their expectation. If you're the emotional one, your calm sounds rehearsed. If you're the quiet one, your assertiveness sounds aggressive. If you're the responsible one, your boundaries sound cold. You cannot win that game by arguing harder. You win it by stepping outside the game entirely. When Beatrice started the smear campaign, my instinct wasn't to defend myself publicly. It was to document everything. That wasn't emotional detachment. That was strategic clarity. Here's the advice I wish someone had given me years ago. If you're dealing with a family conflict where image is being weaponized, stop trying to win emotionally. Start collecting facts. Stop explaining your character. Start preserving your credibility. Do not send angry texts. Do not post reactive statements. Do not vent publicly in a way that can be screenshot. Because the person focused on image will always try to provoke you into looking unstable. And if you react impulsively, you confirm their narrative. Reputation is a form of currency. Beatrice understood that. She just used it recklessly. She tried to spend mine to protect hers. The only reason I survived that smear campaign was because I refused to react theatrically. I didn't shout at the gala. I didn't accuse her without documentation. I waited until I had evidence that could stand without my emotion attached to it. If you're in a situation where a family member is controlling the narrative, ask yourself this. Are you trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you? If the answer is yes, you're wasting energy. There's another hard truth. Sometimes your family will choose the version of events that preserves their comfort, not the one that honors your integrity. And that doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're disrupting a story they've been telling themselves for years. When my parents blocked my calls, it hurt more than the financial suspension. Not because I needed their approval, but because it confirmed something I had avoided facing. Their loyalty was tied to status. When Beatrice had rank, prestige, visibility, she represented success. When I had questions and documentation, I represented disruption. Families that prioritize image often fear disruption more than dishonesty. So here's what I want you to think about. If you've ever been labeled difficult because you asked questions, if you've ever been told you were too intense because you demanded accountability, if you've ever been the only one unwilling to pretend everything was fine, ask yourself this. Were you actually the problem, or were you the only one unwilling to protect a lie? Standing alone feels isolating at first, but isolation is not the same as wrongness. There were nights in that motel room when it would have been easier to apologize, to say I overreacted, to let the trust transfers go and salvage a version of family peace. That peace would have been built on silence. And silence has interest rates. It costs you later. It costs you self-respect. It costs you credibility. It costs you trust in your own instincts. If you learn nothing else from my story, learn this. Being the person who tells the truth in a family that values appearance will cost you comfort, but it will buy you clarity, and clarity is worth more than belonging to a lie. When everything fell apart, I stopped trying to be understood by people invested in misunderstanding me. I focused on being correct. And correct is quiet. Correct doesn't argue at dinner tables, correct files motions, correct keeps receipts, correct waits. If you're in the middle of something similar right now, take a breath. Don't chase approval from people who only respect status. Don't argue with someone who needs you unstable. Don't sacrifice your integrity just to keep the peace. Peace built on denial is temporary. Peace built on truth is permanent. And if you have to choose between being liked and being right, choose being right. You can rebuild relationships later. You cannot easily rebuild integrity once you trade it away. I keep Abigail's coin in a drawer by the front door, not in a display case. That's intentional. I could have framed it. I could have mounted it in a shadow box with a dramatic plaque. People do that with things that make them feel important. But that coin was never about looking important. It was about access. There's a difference between authority and power, and most people confuse the two. Authority is visible. It comes with rank titles, corner offices, reserved parking spaces, and applause at banquets. Power is functional. It moves systems. It controls outcomes. It operates whether anyone is watching or not. Beatrice had authority. She had the rank, the podium, the interviews, the award nights. When she walked into a room, people stood straighter. Abigail had power. She controlled operational funding for missions most of the public never heard about. She made decisions that determined whether supplies moved on time, whether units were funded, whether contingency plans activated. Nobody clapped for that. Nobody posted about it online. But when she approved a transfer, things happened. I had competence. And competence doesn't sparkle. It doesn't trend. It doesn't photograph well. But competence compounds. That's something I want you to understand, especially if you feel overlooked right now. In our culture, visibility gets rewarded fast. Competence gets rewarded slow. Visibility is loud. Competence is steady. Beatrice could command a room with her voice. She understood optics. She knew how to frame narratives, how to emphasize her role in success stories. And for years that worked. But optics don't hold up in forensic audits. Charisma can win a conversation. It cannot win against documentation. There's a lesson there. If you're building your life around applause, your stability depends on other people's reactions. If you're building your life around skill, your stability depends on what you can actually do. One disappears the moment perception shifts. The other survives scrutiny. When the investigation started, Beatrice tried to lean on her record. Her awards, her commendations, her public standing. None of that erased transaction logs. None of that reversed digital signatures. None of that changed hospital admission dates. Competence outlasts charisma when the lights come on. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it with clarity. I used to resent how easily Beatrice moved through rooms, how naturally she absorbed attention, how often people assumed she was the more capable one because she sounded confident. But confidence and capability are not the same thing. Confidence is a presentation skill. Capability is a performance metric. You can develop both. But if you only develop the first, you eventually get exposed. Let me ask you something. Are you spending more time polishing your image than sharpening your skills? Because image has diminishing returns. Skill has compound interest. When I was in logistics, nobody celebrated supply chain optimization. Nobody threw banquets for contingency routing plans. But when something broke, guess who they called the quiet team in the background? The ones who knew how to fix it. In your own life, you might be that person. The one who handles problems while someone else takes credit. The one who works late while someone else gives the presentation. The one who builds structure while someone else decorates it. It's frustrating, I know. There were nights I wondered if I should have moved into a more visible role. If I should have chased a position that came with more public recognition. But here's the truth. When the crisis came, my skills were portable. Beatrice's image was not. When my retirement pay was suspended, I didn't panic because I knew how to analyze systems. I knew how to document. I knew how to build a case. When she tried to isolate me socially, I didn't collapse because my sense of value wasn't tied to the room's approval. That's quiet power. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand validation. It just works. And when tested, it holds. If you're in a season where someone else is being celebrated while you're doing the groundwork, don't assume you're losing. You might be building something that doesn't show up until it matters. Here's something else I learned. Authority can be taken away. Rank can be stripped. Titles can disappear overnight. Beatrice went from colonel to former colonel in a matter of months. The applause stopped. The invitations stopped. The phone calls slowed, because much of her network was built around proximity to status. Competence doesn't evaporate like that. If tomorrow I lost every asset tied to that house, I would still know how to build systems, evaluate data, and protect resources. That's security, not a uniform, not a title, skill. So here's my advice to you. If you feel overshadowed by someone louder, don't compete on volume. Compete on mastery. If someone else is better at self-promotion, let them have it. You focus on being undeniable when evidence is required. If you're early in your career, invest in learning how things actually work, not just how they look. Learn how contracts function. Learn how money moves. Learn how systems break. Learn how to document properly. Those skills don't trend, but they rescue you when trends collapse. And one more thing, do not confuse being unseen with being unimportant. Abigail was unseen by the public. She was not unimportant. In fact, the people who truly understood the structure knew exactly who she was. When General Miller saw that coin, he didn't see a souvenir. He saw infrastructure. He saw responsibility. He saw someone who had been operating at a level beyond ceremony. That moment wasn't dramatic because of emotion. It was dramatic because reality surfaced. Quiet power doesn't need to announce itself. It waits until it's required. So if you're feeling overlooked right now, ask yourself this. Are you building applause, or are you building ability? Because one will disappear when perception shifts. The other will still be there when everything gets audited. And when life audits you financially, emotionally, professionally, it won't care how charismatic you sounded at dinner. It will care what you can actually sustain. That's the difference between loud authority and quiet power. One performs, the other prevails. I locked the front door after my parents left and didn't feel guilty about it. That might sound cold. A year ago, it would have felt cold to me too. But now it feels accurate. They had come over for dinner. We sat at the same kitchen table where they once told me to stop embarrassing the family. The conversation was polite, controlled, careful. My mother brought up the weather twice. My father asked about the veteran fund once. Neither mentioned Beatrice directly. Progress, I guess. When they stood to leave, my mother hesitated near the doorway. "Are you sure you don't want us to have a spare key?" she asked. "No," I said calmly. She nodded like she expected that answer but hoped for a different one. That moment right there is what most people misunderstand about boundaries. Boundaries are not revenge. If I wanted revenge, I would have cut them off completely, blocked their numbers, refused financial support, disappeared. That would have been emotional retaliation. What I chose instead was structure. They live in a smaller apartment now. I cover part of their rent because I can, and because I don't believe in punishing elderly parents financially for poor judgment. But they don't have access to my home, my accounts, or my decisions. Access is earned, not inherited. That's something I had to learn the hard way. For years, I believed forgiveness meant restoration. If you forgave someone, you let things go back to how they were. That belief cost me. Forgiveness is internal. Access is external. You can forgive someone and still restrict their access to your life. You can release anger without reopening the door. Those are separate actions. When everything with Beatrice collapsed, I had moments where revenge would have been easy. I had documentation that could have destroyed her publicly beyond what the legal system required. I could have given interviews. I could have told every detail to every outlet that would listen. I didn't. Not because she deserved protection, but because I deserved peace. Revenge keeps you tied to the person who hurt you. Boundaries free you from them. There's a difference between wanting someone to suffer and wanting to stop suffering yourself. At first, I had to be honest with myself. I was angry, not just at Beatrice, at my parents, at the years of subtle comparisons, at the dinners where my deployments were summarized in one sentence and her briefings were dissected in detail. I had to admit that anger before I could choose something better. If you pretend you're not angry, you don't build boundaries, you build resentment. Resentment leaks. It shows up in tone, in sarcasm, in passive-aggressive comments, in distance that nobody understands. Boundaries are cleaner than resentment. They're clear. For me, boundaries look like this. No unannounced visits, no financial co-signing, no involvement in trust management decisions, no private conversations where history gets rewritten. If my parents start minimizing what happened, I end the conversation. If they attempt to defend Beatrice's intentions, I state facts once and move on. I don't argue. I don't debate. I don't try to convince. Because here's another truth: boundaries don't require agreement. They require enforcement. You don't need someone to understand your limit. You just need them to respect it. And if they don't, you reduce access further. That's not cruelty. That's maintenance. If you're struggling with family right now, ask yourself this: are you maintaining peace, or are you maintaining proximity? Those are different things. Some people keep access to family because distance feels like betrayal. They tolerate disrespect because they fear being labeled ungrateful. I used to think distance meant disloyalty. Now I understand distance can mean stability. You cannot heal in an environment that keeps reopening the wound. And here's something uncomfortable but necessary. Sometimes family members prefer the version of you that was easier to control. The agreeable one, the quiet one, the one who didn't push back. When you change, when you enforce limits, when you say no without apology, it disrupts their comfort. They might call you cold. They might say you've changed. They're right, you have. Growth looks like distance to people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. That doesn't make the growth wrong. I don't hate Beatrice. I don't sit around hoping she fails. I also don't feel responsible for rebuilding her life. She made decisions, consequences followed. That's not revenge. That's cause and effect. When I fund the Veteran Support Initiative, I do it without bitterness. When I send my parents rent assistance, I do it without resentment. But when I lock my door at night, I do it without guilt. And that balance took discipline. If you're building boundaries right now, here's practical advice. Write them down. Don't keep them vague in your head. Be specific. What behavior will you no longer tolerate? What access will you limit? What topics are no longer open for debate? Communicate once, clearly, calmly, then stop explaining. You are not required to re-justify your boundaries every time someone challenges them. And expect pushback. People accustomed to unlimited access rarely accept limits gracefully. Stay consistent. Consistency teaches people how to treat you. In the Army, we were taught that structure creates safety. The same is true in families. Chaos feels dramatic. Boundaries feel boring. Choose boring. Boring is stable. When I stand in this house now, I don't feel victorious. I feel steady. No more walking on emotional eggshells. No more competing for approval. No more negotiating my worth at the dinner table. Just structure. If you're in a place where you're deciding whether to set a boundary with someone who shares your last name, ask yourself this: are you protecting the relationship? Or are you protecting your peace? Because sometimes the healthiest version of a relationship is one with a locked door and scheduled visits. And that's not revenge. That's responsibility.
Final note. This story is a work of fiction, but the valuable lessons we discuss are entirely real and continue to happen to many people every day. If this style isn't for you, that's perfectly okay. Please feel free to look for other content that better suits your needs.